Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second series. I'm beginning this with a tribute to Professor Richard Gregory, who died earlier this summer, who was a wonderful teacher, both in his writings and in his lectures, in his webcasts, and a very generous and well-loved gentleman whom we will miss very much indeed. This is an image of his face. It's the first visual illusion of the evening, and it represents a hollowed-out mask which has been painted, and that painting shows a very realistic representation that we interpret as a three-dimensional face coming towards us. It's really quite extraordinary. We don't see that as a hollow image at all. We'll be revisiting that later on, and you can also visit it yourself at the grandillusions.com website, and they've kindly and generously allowed me to show it to you tonight. Thanks to Freddie, Louise and Maxim, who allowed me a lot of time away from them in a busy summer of cricket to prepare this lecture, and there they are with their own 3D version when they watched Shrek. Now, a lot of people were very helpful and generous. Richard Gregory, I went into ophthalmology having been given his book in 1973 to read, and it made a very big impression on me long before I'd even gone to medical school. Michael Bach, Bo Lotto, Michael Morgan, Dale Purvis, Edward Elson, Stephen Dakin, Kitaoka, Nicholas Wade, anything any of these people write is worth reading. Now, illusion comes from the word Latin illudere, to mock, and it's mocking the certainty of what we see in the perceived world. There are many, many definitions of visual illusions, and none of them are very satisfactory. Perhaps the commonest one is a perceived image that differs from object reality. But that's not a good definition, because it begs the question, what's reality? And the word image for a percept is also confusing, because we're using the word image on the back of the retina, and then we're using another word for image, which is something that's going on in our minds that we're imagining. So it's not a really good definition, and we're going to work on this a little bit during this lecture. Now, studying illusions gives us some insight into the computations that the brain does to construct vision. Vision isn't just a camera with a photograph on the back of the eye, as we explained in the last series. You could argue that as we begin to understand these processes, illusions are not illusions at all. They're just the way optics and the eye and the brain works. Nowadays, psychologists dominate the field. Previously, there were architects and painters and mathematicians. Psychologists have their own private language, and we tend to imagine psychologists as being with sort of mad patients. As the quotation at the bottom shows here, the patient's tearful and crying constantly. She also appears to be depressed. Actually, written at the bottom of real clinical notes. Also, as well as visual hallucinations, I'd like to point out you can get auditory hallucinations as well. And you can probably get taste illusions, and any illusions, touch illusions, can occur. And we know about those from people who've got phantom limbs. I'm just going to deal with the vision ones. Now, ancient theories of illusions really came quite close to the bone, actually. The mind sees, the mind hears, the rest is blind and deaf. We'd probably agree with that nowadays. Ptolemy, we mentioned in one of the previous lectures, worked out what was happening here when we look into a pond and the fish isn't here, it appears to be here, because of the bending of light, the same way that sticks or pencils in a glass. So we wouldn't call that an illusion now, although it's not exactly what we expect to see, and if we were to poke a stick in and try and hit that fish, we'd miss. The ancient Greeks invented illusionistic art. It took them about 250 years to perfect it, and unfortunately none survives. There are fragments in paintings in tombs, and this is a fresco from the tomb of the diver in Campania, southern Italy. Now, the Renaissance took exactly the same period of time to eliminate all this falseness out of pictures and invent a perspectival system. Stories of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, Pliny records this. Zeuxis had done this wonderful painting. It was so beautiful, so accurate, so mimicked life that the birds came down from the skies to peck at the grapes. He then turns to his arch rival, Parrhasius, and says, well, let's see what you can do. Just take the curtains back on your painting and let's have a look at it. And he stood there. He said, take the curtains back on your painting and let's have a look at it. And he said, the curtains are the painting. And that is where He said that he'd deceived the birds, but Perseus had deceived Zeuxis. He was actually quite an arrogant man and went on to an unhappy death, laughing himself to death after he'd painted a portrait of an elderly lady who wanted to be painted as Aphrodite. When he saw his own painting, he thought it was so hilarious, he died. Now, illusions enable us to look at vision in a completely different way. Vision is the process for discovering from images what is present in the world and where it is. This is a really rather good definition of what vision is. And what we're talking about here is that we don't know where any particular image comes from. We don't know the space of that image. This, and this object all produce exactly the same retinal image. So we have to work out where it is using other parameters. And those other parameters we use are in the brain. And many of them are actually past experience. We have to learn to see. And we construct vision from very incomplete and sometimes conflicting data. William James, brother of the famous writer, son of the eccentric Swedenborgian, whose godfather was Ralph Waldo Emerson, as a matter of interest, a very extraordinary family. Whilst part of what we perceive comes through our senses from the object, before us, another part, and it may be the larger part, always comes out of our own mind. Hermann von Helmholtz was the famous German polymath, and he persuaded us that perceptions were unconscious inferences. So what we're actually perceiving, what we think vision is actually something that's going on in our brain. We're inventing it. Richard Gregory took this a bit further, and he suggested that perceptions were hypotheses generated from this imperfect data. And then it enables us to predict things about the world. So we can predict unsensed things. I can predict that that glass is going to be cold and wet. I can't see it's cold and wet, but I can predict that it's going to be cold and wet. And that's what we're using our visual system for, to project this model out. They're very similar to scientific hypotheses, but we project them into space. We accept them as reality. And that's where it gets confusing, because they're not real. None of this is real, as I'm going to show you. I'm going to try and persuade you today that we do not see something that is there. We sometimes see things that are not there, and quite a lot of what we see is very different from what is out there. These won't work because you need to be close up to them, but they're in your handout, and you can go and play with them using one eye at a time, and you'll see that when you fixate on the cross and you bring it in, the blue spot disappears. When you fixate on this cross, the white area at a particular distance fills in with this jazzy background. We're making up something that's not there. And secondly, we get all sorts of things wrong, particularly when they're sticking up out of the ground. And Purves actually comments a lot on this on his writings and websites. A lot of what's happening is because of the way we see. You will remember that the eye doesn't respond to a large splodge of light. In fact, if you put a large splodge of light on the eye, the neurons don't particularly change. They go tick, 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 and large splodge of light, tick, tick, tick. What they do respond to are small spots of light, or circles of light, or small spots of dark in them, when they really do become very active indeed. And this is called center surround. And there's two sorts of center surround. It could be on, which is when the middle bit's there, or it could be off, when the middle bit is dark. They're evenly distributed. In fact, there's recent evidence come out this year that there may be more off ones than on ones, because dark things in the environment are more important to us than bright things in the environment, like sharks. Now, the consequence of this processing is that if we look at two shades of grey here, they appear quite different. But if we mask the background, you can see they're the same. This is not only for grey. It happens for colours. We see two shades of lilac here that are quite distinct. When we shade the background, we can see they're the same. This is due to this opponency, due to this mechanism of lateral inhibition. And it works quite powerfully. All these greys are exactly the same shade, except in your handout, because the printer isn't good enough to do it. But they are on my computer screen, because I spent hours making sure that they were. We don't think they are, but if I was to move this and match it and come out of the screen and show you, and I can do that if anyone really doesn't believe me at the end. Now, the brain does something slightly different. Unlike retina cells, which respond to still things and to patches of light, the brain responds to moving things, particularly bars of light. And it responds to them in certain orientations. And if you get the orientation wrong, it stops firing very, very quickly. In fact, the decay at 10% really, really goes off at 10 degrees, sorry. And remember, the difference between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock on a clock face is 3 times that. It's 30 degrees. So these are very, very sensitive. And the receptive fields are much, much larger than those small retinal receptive fields. And we use all this to construct the image from the eye going to complex and hypercomplex cells, and then we have the processes go through separate channels for colour, form, motion, stereo, facial recognition, recognizing your grandma. These segregation of the channels are one of the reasons why we can end up having illusions and not seeing what we see. Now, this is going to be interactive, okay? So what we're going to do is to have a little show of hands. Those of you who are going to actually say things when we ask them, okay? Those of you who are not going to say anything, that's the majority. And those of you who are not going to do anything, whatever we say up here. Okay, let's go through this. 12, 13, 14. You'd all agree with that. You all can perceive this, including the people using the low vision aids. I've made it large, so hopefully you can. 12, 13, 14, we'd all agree. Look at this. Some of you in the audience will see a shape in here. Many of you in the audience won't, unless you've seen it before. Could those in the audience who can't see anything, just see a splodge here, please put your hands up? Okay. And those who can see something? Right, those are the people who've seen it before. Now, I've got some very, very bad news for the rest of you. I'm now going to show you what this is, and you will never see this ever again as splodges. It's a dog. It's a Dalmatian dog. Here, with its tail, and it's sniffing the ground as Dalmatian. In fact, all dogs do. I suppose if there was another dog there, it'd be sniffing its butt. But anyway, it's sniffing the ground in this case. So, you've now seen that. We'll flick back, and we'll now flick to it, and you see the dog. Sorry, you'll never, ever, never, ever see that image again. There's other images out there you can go and play with, like with giraffes and various other things, and we'll talk about some of those later. So what was this again? Can we hear it? 12, 13, 14, you're quite sure? Okay? And you know what you see is real, don't you? And you know that this has nothing to do with culture, context, or anything like this, of course, because you're certain that it's real. Okay, let's have a look. Let's see if the mind. What's this? ABC, because we've now changed the context. That has exactly the same retinal image as the previous did, but you're now seeing something completely different than you saw before. And it's very difficult to see that as A13C, even though you know it is A13C, because you've all told me just a few minutes ago when we showed the other slide. So depending on the context, we impose meaning on this raw data that's coming in. So there's lots of different types of visual illusions, and perhaps if we classified them, this could help us. We have physiological illusions, which are something to do with science, and then we have cognitive illusions, which is something to do with mentality and thinking, and of course that's not science, that's the realm of psychologists. However, we're going to look and see that, in fact, there's an awful lot of science can be done on these cognitive illusions. We have after images, we have changing shapes, we have distortions of size and impossible figures. We're going to be going through and discussing these. But this classification really isn't very satisfactory. And Richard Gregory put together a lot of work to classify all sorts of visual things into what he calls the periodic table. And this was his first attempts to try and get this going. And he said there's basically two sorts of illusions which everyone agrees with. There's those of the physical cause, so it could be a disturbance of optics, like the bend of the stick in the water, or it could be mist, something disturbing, something coming to the eye. So what we're actually seeing isn't what's out there. There could be a disturbance of the sensory signals, as I showed you before, with that opponency. So we see two shades of grey or lilac, but in fact we know they're not. Then there could be problems with the mental, the cognitive cause. That's the general rules. We could, for example, when we see a flock of birds flying together, we know the one at the end is flying the same as the one at the beginning, because the general rules of movement tell us that that big blotch in the sky, they're all moving in the same direction. There could be a specific knowledge. We could think about texture. You know what this cloth is going to feel like from the far end of the room, because you know about these things. And he related this to language, and actually was on the verge of coming to some very difficult discussions. Because he was actually going to say that is language actually based on intelligent vision? You know, and is this Chomsky's innate deep structure of language? So ambiguity, people like us. Distortions, he's miles taller than her. A paradox, she's a dark-haired blonde. Or a fiction, they live in a mirror. We know that person in the mirror doesn't live in the mirror. And then these are the illusions he attaches with those. So we're starting to be able to look and structure these different illusions. Now there's some problems with this. We don't know the cause of lots of illusions. Secondly, some illusions have lots of causes. And thirdly, every time I read a paper, someone's proposing a different cause for an illusion that everybody thought was sorted out. So maybe we just go back to this, which is a list of illusions, saying what they are, physiological, geometric, angle, distortion, ambiguous, colour illusions. And certainly that's how most illusions are classified on their larger websites. We'll start off with the physiological ones, and we'll talk about neural adaptation. This is the tilt after effect, discovered in 1937, and this predicted and anticipated the findings of Hubel and Wiesel in the 1950s when they were putting electrons into the brain and into the retina. You can see here there's a grating with a bar of vertical grating. Yes? Good, because it is a bar of vertical. Good. And here you've got them tilting. Yes? Good, because they're tilting. Now you can't do this on a big screen, but you do this at home. If you stare at this for 30 seconds, looking at the B, and then you suddenly transfer back to A, these tilt in the opposite direction to the grating that you had adapted to. And the reason this happens is in the normal, we fire these orientation cells. These are the cells orientated straight up, and these are tilting. These fire the most, and that signal tells us it's a vertical grating. We look here, and this is firing the most. These cells on either side are firing a little bit. They're just within the 10 degrees. And this signal, which is deviated towards the green, tells us that that's a tilt to the right. If we stare at this for a long time, these neurons get tired, if you like. They get worn out, so they're less sensitive. We now flip back to look at the straight grating, and whoops, this has now shifted this curve over to the left, and what we see is a signal to the brain that tells us that's tilted the opposite direction. Very plausible. Probably not entirely true, but it's the one that's in the books. There are some other effects that people are thinking about. This is an ancient illusion. It was known about by Aristotle, although he didn't actually describe it quite accurately. Purkinje was the first one to describe it, but he never really got it popular. He looked at a cavalry parade going past, and when the cavalry parade had finished going past, all the background was moving in the opposite direction. And Robert Adams described this after visiting the Falls of Foyers in Scotland. Here they are. If you look at this waterfall for long enough, you suddenly see the rocks start moving upwards. And this is exactly the same thing, neural adaptation, and it's now known as the waterfall illusion. Here's another neural adaptation. I think we can do this. Could we turn the lights down for 20 seconds? We can only give 20 seconds because the talks otherwise will overrun. Look at the central cross here for 20 seconds. Lights out for 20 seconds if possible. Now look at this. Did anyone have a religious experience? We can put the lights back on if we like. I had a religious experience when I first saw this. It's called the Pac-Man illusion, first described by Hinton, and thanks to Michael Bach for allowing me to put it on in the talk tonight. If we look at the central cross here, what's happening is these are switching off every 0.1 of a second or so. And I'm going to carry on looking at it. So what actually happens, they disappear first of all, you're quite right. And if you still look at the X in the middle and don't look at the spots, you'll suddenly see there's a bunch of green things racing around. Completely illusionistic. They're not there at all. And not only is this giving you a perception of motion, it's giving you an after image of colour. So there's lots and lots of different effects going on here. This isn't just one visual illusion, it's a bunch of visual illusions in one. And actually, a long time ago, Troxler described this fading. If you look at a stimulus, and a stimulus is put onto a retinal location for long enough, eventually you ignore it. It goes away, you don't see it. Now, geometric illusions, well, these are the really famous ones that started the science of illusion. Johannes Müller started this off, the son of a Koblenz shoemaker, and a famous fish scientist, got into the Humboldt University in Berlin. And he was interested, when he was falling asleep, he started getting visual illusions. So what he started to do is to take loads of drugs, and the drugs they took in those days was coffee, caffeine. And this sleep deprivation and caffeine eventually led to him going mad. He recovered, and in April 1827, he married a very beautiful and talented musician called Nanny Zeiler, and he immediately had a breakdown and went mad again. He comes down to us because he was famous, because he was the first person to call these visual distortions illusions. Nowadays, we wouldn't call these necessarily illusions, because Sir Francis Galton, later on in the century, tried to say that these were hallucinations, which are a kind of appearance wholly due to fancy, and an illusion, which is a fanciful perception of objects actually seen. Okay, now what's interesting about this is that Richard Gregory is now coming back to this and trying to classify hallucinations as part of the whole gamut of visual illusions. Now, let's have a look here. Let's look at A. Does line A look the same length as line B? Hands up. Yes? Yeah, it should do. Yeah, it looks the same? Okay. Right. The one that does look... What is this one? Does this look the same as this one? No. Actually, it is. This is the one that's right, and this is the one that's wrong. So if you do drawings of paintings of things and you want them to be the same length, you have to make it wrong to actually see it right. And this isn't just in paintings, this is in architecture and all sorts of things. And it's extraordinary why this should be the case. And it is still, even though Fick described this in 1851, the source of some controversy. Is it due to the curvature of the retina? The Kunt effect. The Kunt effect is if you bisect a line, looking at it absolutely at right angles, you end up with two unequal lengths. Extraordinary. Do it with the left eye and the left hand, you get two equal lengths, but the other way around, which is quite interesting. Could it be the horizontal field effect? This is what the art historians from the Bauhaus in the Weimar Republic would suggest. If something that comes closer to a frame, we see it as bigger than if it's further away from a frame, even if it's not a different size. Could it be gravity? Corrin argues the effect is that we have something inbuilt in us because of gravity that sees tall things like steeples on churches as being taller than they actually are. Now, it's interesting, it's not due to the bisection illusion necessarily, or not entirely, because it still exists when you do an L. That's still 5% larger. So what an extraordinary thing, and what a simple thing. And yet our brains are telling us something really fundamental here. This was Kunt, the guy we mentioned before, and that was his illusion. But it became famous with Oppel, who actually didn't describe the Kunt illusion. They described the Oppel-Kunt illusion, which is that if you have two lines, and they have a lot of things in between them, it appears to be longer than the two lines when they don't have things between them. This illusion won't work at a distance, but you can actually look at it straight up. And it's a very powerful and strong illusion, which is a very basic part of how we see. This is an extraordinary illusion by Zollner. Zollner noticed that if you had hatched lines in straight lines, these no longer appear straight. They appear to be curving in. Would most people agree with that? He sent this off to Poggendorff, who was the editor of the Annalen der Physik und Chemie. Sorry, this is an opportunity for those of you who like horrible foreign accents to come to all of these talks. It's the Germans' turn this time. It was the French a couple of times ago. Now, these black parallel lines seem to be unparalleled. Now, he's quite famous, Zollner. He actually had a crater on the moon. He's probably one of the more intelligent men of his age, despite the haircut. And he was unfortunately tricked by Henry Slade, who'd also tricked Conan Doyle. And he began to believe in the fourth dimension. This is Henry Slade. He was found out in England to be a fake and was in Bow Street Court, but managed to flip and escape the country while he was under bail and ends up in Germany, where he befriends Zollner and does a number of his trickeries, and Zollner begins to believe in a fourth dimension. Eventually, people are getting suspicious in Germany. He returns to England under an assumed identity, and unfortunately, he dies penniless and an alcoholic in Michigan sanatorium in 1905. This illusion, whilst it's quite extraordinary, was sent to this man, Poggendorff, who noticed yet another illusion within it, because this is the original drawing, and the lines are rather thick. And what it shows is you can see this steel tube coming down behind the wooden board, yes? Okay? But it isn't. The steel tube actually has a black ending on it, and this is something quite different. This happens in everybody's visual system. This is how we see slanted lines. Is it because we see slanted lines in a peculiar way? Well, obviously. We can't all be wrong all the time. What's interesting about it is that people have done a lot of work on it. It only really works when the lines are very slanted. When they're horizontal, it doesn't work at all. That actually is the continuation of this. But Michael Morgan, in an extraordinary series of experiments, showed that you don't even need a real border for this. You can have an illusory border. So you can have an illusion within an illusion, if you like. And here's the Poggendorff effect. And to show when he moves the Peckman around, there isn't it's no longer an illusion. That's extraordinary. Even more extraordinary is that it exists in the real world. This is an important thing for us. This is a range-finding device from Dale Purvis's line. And what they do is they construct from here, they can work out the distance of every single pixel in that field. And what they actually show, that statistically it's far more likely, if you have a slanting line, that those two things are going to be connected. And the connection, because of distortion and perspective, is that it's going to be not contiguous, as if it was a straight line in a two-dimensional surface. When we decided to amalgamate the various countries of the Northern Sea, we had to get a flag. And if we made a flag without the Poggendorf illusion in it, would look horrible. This is another one of those now. You can never look at the English flag again and see it's actually got straight lines in it. It doesn't. It's a Poggendorf illusion, done deliberately to make sure that when we look at this, it appears to be straight. Quite extraordinary. So, here we are. Natural scenes can count for this effect. In natural scenes, this is the reality. So a two-dimensional illusion is an artificial construct. It's not that the brain is being fooled. The brain is seeing what the brain should do, which is to know that two lines in the real world look like this. There's a whole bunch of other angle illusions came out about the same time and over the next 40 years. And we can go through them. Herring. He's quite famous because we're going to talk about him in colour vision, because he was the guy who totally overturned what everybody knew about colour and proposed a system of colour opponency, which I mentioned earlier, which can explain after images as well. And this is the Herring illusion. These two lines don't appear straight. The opposite one was by Wilhelm Wundt, who was really the father of experimental psychology. And here he is in a lab doing experiments on students, which you're not allowed to do nowadays without having permission. And here's his psychological experiments that he's doing on them. So this is to show that psychology is a science. Now these lines appear, this is the opposite, really. And William Orbison described this. This looks a bit distorted, and there's variations of this. If you're putting geometrical shapes, squares or circles, and there are background to it, you will actually see distortion. Even curvature. Which of these curves represents the largest circle? Well, they all represent the same circle, so I'll just save you having to put your hands up on that one. But you're going to have to put your hands up on this one. Which is the bigger? A, hands up for A, hands up for B, hands up, they're both the same. Yes, they're both the same, of course, which of course you know, but you don't see them as both the same. So what we see isn't what we get. Now this is quite important, because if you go and spend billions of pounds and you build a marble temple on top of a hill, and it all looks squiggly, you're in serious trouble. And that's what it would have looked like if you didn't actually realise that we had these illusions. Now, whether they did this deliberately for illusions, or whether they did it for other reasons, like to get the rain off it, or just because it looked nice, is a moot point. But they didn't just do it once. They did it in other temples as well. So if we look here, and this was actually worked out that by Pennethorne. And he said, if things look straight, then they can't be straight, because we know if they are straight, they look bent. So what's going on in things like the Parthenon? So the Society of Dilettanti in 1846 sent off Penrose to go and investigate this theory. He needed lots and lots of measurements, and it's an exceedingly boring book with sort of fractions of inches was measured. And indeed he found out something that was very interesting. This platform isn't flat, because if it was flat it would look curved. It's actually curved, so it looks flat. And it may not be because it's curved, it's also very good at getting rid of the rainwater as well. Similar things happen here with columns. This column is larger in diameter than this or this column, and furthermore the space between here and there is different than the space between there and there and there. And this is to account for the fact that originally this had a building on the inside of it before the Turks managed to put an ammo depot in it, which got blown up by the Italians from the adjacent hill, creating the scenic ruin that we see today. Originally, this would have been looked at from a black background, and black backgrounds make things look different than if you look at things on a bright background. And they took this all into account, and apparently it looks really good when it's not a ruin. Now, these sort of effects are taken into account in many, many buildings. If you want to fool the system, this is the Library of Celsus. This had a particularly strict architectural briefing, was that it was a very narrow piece of land. So he did lots of illusions in here to make it look like a big monumental structure. Now, at this stage, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, people are beginning to realise there's a lot more to visual illusions than just pretty pictures which you go and show the children. They realised that all sorts of things caused illusions. This is the pattern which was being woven by children in a kindergarten, and it's apparent that those lines are tilting. Using this, Fraser made this series of concentric circles, not a spiral. This is a false spiral. And he did a lot of research on this, showing that these directional units were really important in generating this. So here, this looks like a spiral, but in fact, if you put two circles over it, you can see, in fact, that it's two circles. Now, originally, this was explained as an irradiation illusion, and Helmholtz showed that this looks much larger than this. And this is used in art. They're not. They're identical sizes. Nobody's really fully explained irradiance yet. But what he's saying is the whiteness of the square is pushing itself out and making it appear to be larger than the black square. Munsterberg had found a similar effect in these walls. These bricks don't look square. They look a bit wedgy. Munsterberg was a really interesting character with an astonishing pair of glasses that we need to use for the glasses lecture, because these had already fallen out of fashion by the time he was wearing them in America, and a handlebar moustache that was the height of fashion when he went to America. He wanted to make America friends with Germany, which wasn't a popular thing to do in the First World War, and had a sudden death while lecturing in 1916 on the platform at Harvard, which was a sad end to any lecturer. But I suppose, as they say, you know, old professors don't die, they just lose their faculties. And in Bristol, Richard Gregory, well, someone in his lab, noticed this cafe where they would go for lunch showed a very peculiar effect. And that is with the offset, it looks as if these lines aren't entirely parallel. And it turns out that this is the generic of all these previous twisted chord and spiral illusions. This is the granddaddy of them. And the Munsterberg illusion is just a very particular effect of this. Aishia Kitaoka has actually produced an astonishing spiral using the cafe wall illusion. And that is a bit disconcerting, because as you move around it, it actually moves a bit. So I've left it small there in case anyone has motion sickness. You can actually make buildings that deliberately have, you know, over the last 2,000 years we've spent fortunes on marble temples making sure they don't have distortions. Along come the Australians and make a building that does have the distortion in it, and actually rather effectively. Now, size and shape depend on how you look at them as well. This is the famous Ponzo illusion. A brief show of hands, you know, it gets sort of repetitive, so I won't do that, is that everybody sees this as larger than this. Everybody sees that brick as larger than that brick. They're not. They're identical sizes. And there's a reason why we see things like this, and we'll come on to that in a moment. It's how we perceive things at distance. Could it be the framing effect? Well, that could be. This is closer to the edges of the frame. The one at the bottom is further away from the edges, so we perceive it as being smaller. Could it be how we see things in real life in depth? The Muller-Lyer illusion was one of the most famous illusions of the 1800s. Two horizontal lines are exactly the same length, but if you put a diverging arrow on it, it appears to be longer. There are at least 20 different explanations we put forward for this. One of the most interesting ones that I quite like, but is probably wrong, is Richard Gregory's version, and it says it depends on the carpentered environment. That is, if you come from a culture where you've got buildings, you're looking at the Muller-Lyer illusion all the time. This is Northumberland House before it was knocked down and built to the new one, and this was the original one that was built on the site of St Mary's Ranceville Hospital that we mentioned in a talk what seems like 1,000,000 years ago when we did medieval hospitals. That was actually the site. So here we are. So we're looking at this. It's going to appear to be smaller than if we're looking further away in the distance. So what are these cultural aspects? You see, if you're looking here, looking in a room. What happens in people who have round cultures, like Zulus, or, in this case, ancient Irish? This is a photograph taken from Eamon O'Donoghue's plane as we flew over the Burren, just outside where he lives, as we go over Clare. What he did was to use the wrong illusion. Maybe he should have used this version. These dots are the same distance apart as those two dots. So this even works in people who have circular cultures, not carpentered cultures. So the jury's still out. So culture affects what we see. Everybody in the audience over the age of 12, how many mammals do you see here? 2, right. Okay, people under 12 would disagree with you. They see 9. But once you get over 12, you no longer see that, which is a shame, really, isn't it? This was a more recently described illusion. Most people would think these towers are leaning, aren't they? The Leaning Tower of Pisa, and they're leaning away from each other. Actually, what's interesting here is they're two identical photographs, one next to each other. But because of our perspectival clues, we cannot accept that, because it should be leaning in to be the same picture, and therefore we see it diverging out. And the same thing happens with this, where this window is identical to this window, but we actually see it as leaning in, which we shouldn't do at all. This is how we fool the two-dimensional retinal image. Now, the Ebbinghaus illusion, which was first described by Ebbinghaus but popularized by Titchener in his book in 1901, shows that this circle looks much smaller than this circle. This is quite an important illusion, because we're going to come on to this. It's got things like the crowding effect, and maybe come to the moon illusion. Titchener himself was going to die of a brain tumour. Brilliant, eccentric. He was a linguist. When he went to Cambridge, Physiological paper had been published in Dutch, and his boss told him to make a presentation on it the following Wednesday. He said, "I don't speak Dutch." He said, "Well, go and bloody learn it, boy." And he went and did, and presented the paper from the bones of that the following week. He went to work with Willy Wundt and did his PhD in Germany, which was an extraordinary thing for people to do in those days. Lectured to packed audiences, but was eccentric. He wouldn't go to dinner unless the invitation was delivered by a coachman, formally. And so he wasn't very popular with his other lecturers, but the students loved him. Delboff showed a version of this illusion, which is that if you surround a circle with another circle, it appears to be larger than if you didn't, and it works for different sizes, and it works in cafes. Now, perceptual constancy is really what we're aiming at here. We've got to have a system that tells me, when I look at Frank in the front row, he's exactly the same size as Frank is when he's in the back row. Although the retinal image of Frank in the back row is very, very, very much smaller. Here's Frank in the back row, here's Frank in the front row. There's the retinal image in the back row, and there's the retinal image in the front row. It tells me two things. These retinal images are the same size. These people are therefore the same size. These retinal images are a different size, therefore they're twice as far. This man is twice as big. Okay? So we can use this to make a play on things. Here is Shepard's terrar subterrar, which is probably one of the most famous and funny illusions that have been made ever. These two are identical in size. But because of the way we've placed them in a false perspectival image, our brains enlarge this and see it as larger. Now, there's an extraordinary thing that's going on here. The visual map in the brain is actually larger when it sees this. It's not a fixed map. Until now, we thought we had fixed maps that went all the way through from the retina. But what we're having here is rather like the Mac, when you go to the side and you get the genie effect. If you see something, you perceive something that's further away, you literally do see it as bigger. It's not an illusion. You really are. You've got more amount of the brain is attached to this image than to this image, even though on the retina they're the same size. That's extraordinary. Now, we can play with this quite a lot. We can put a ball at the back of a cupboard and a ball at the front, and we see the ball at the back is bigger. In fact, the retinal sizes are the same. So why do we see this as bigger? It's because of the perceptual cues. Several perceptual cues here: change in colour, change in shading, change in geometric perspective. What we actually think we're seeing is this. If it's further away and it's making the same angle, it's therefore got to be bigger. So this is the difference between angular size and true linear size, which is important when we come on to the moon illusion. The moon illusion, or the sun illusion, but I'd recommend you to practice on the moon illusion because it doesn't damage your eyes as much as the sun illusion does when you practice on that. But this didn't bother Van Gogh, because here he is showing his Reaper with the early morning sun rising. I'm going to show you the same version of this picture taken in Streatham last week, later. Now, why does that moon appear large? Now, everybody in this audience has the moon. Nobody in this audience actually knows how big the moon is, so we'll have a little. When we look at the moon, or the sun, which is the same size, let's look at it on the horizon. How many people in the audience think it's this big at arm's length? No. How many people think it's sort of like half the size of your thumbnail at arm's length? Okay, so it's somewhere between those. About the size of your hand? Yeah? Yeah? The size of two hands? About the size of two hands there. Okay. It's actually slightly smaller than the fingernail. Half the fingernail. So very small, 0.5 degrees. So everybody mistakes how big the sun and the moon is. And that's why your photographs of sunsets when you're on honeymoon are such a disappointment. It's as Oscar Wilde said about the Niagara Falls. He said, every American bride's second biggest disappointment. So here's another theory of the moon illusion. Here, this is the moon setting over the Royal Hospital Gardens the other night. Except for it isn't, because that's how we do see it. That's the actual real moon at the top there, which is really rather smaller. Why is it? Is it because this is all crowded with lots of background scenes, so we've got an Ebbinghaus illusion? Because if it's crowded, it looks bigger than when it's got vacuous space surrounding it. It looks a bit smaller, doesn't it? That's a plausible theory, and there is some evidence. There's another theory that comes from Charles Wheatstone's experiments, that if the eyes converge, things seen behind them seem to be larger. We're still out on this. There are many, many theories. I would refer you to Don McCready, the psychology department at the University of Wisconsin, who has very, very strong views about what the moon illusion might tell. Michael Manelli and I are currently doing a series of experiments to see whether we can refute or dispute any of these. It may be that they are several illusions in one. And this lovely poem, reason has moons, but moons not hers, lie mirrored on her sea, confounding her astronomers, but oh, delighting me. As they still do. They're beautiful things to look at moons. You can deliberately distort the visual system. The Ames room is the most famous. You look in and you see this guy looks like a giant, this one looks like the Cray twins, and this one looks smaller in the corner. But actually, you're not looking in a room that's normal at all. This actual room is only made to look normal. In fact, it's sloping up here. This guy is twice the distance away as this guy is. And that's actually what you're seeing. So you're getting this angular size illusion, plus another couple of illusions added in for effect. Now, you actually don't need perspective in this. The major component of this is the horizon. And it's where people are placed on that horizon. And because that horizon isn't what we think it is, we're generating the illusion. We think it's flat, but it isn't. So, more architecture, sorry about this. This is a beautiful building in Rome, which looks very plausible. Statue at the end. It's actually not. It's a very short, tiny corridor. With, it's just an illusion, really. And these illusions were used early on by Palladio, and this is his famous Piazza di Signorina in Vicenza. And this was a rebuild over a 13th century decrepit building, but it was irregular, and he couldn't get all the windows in, so he did a couple of illusions to make all the windows appear to be the same and regular, but in fact they're not. These false pillars, pilasters, which were used, the vertical shaft columns, give Romanesque architecture this wonderful sense of height, and this is Winchester Cathedral, photographed earlier this summer, showing this enormous wonderful sense of space and vertical height that's generated by this optical illusion. Similarly, Bernini's stairs, very, very famous. He's using the pillar illusion that we mentioned in the Parthenon, but deliberately in this time to create a sense of false depth. It's used in painting as well. This is one of the first paintings to use this effect of three-dimensional aspects to create an illusion of space. Trompe-l'oeil. This is the most famous. If you stand directly in the middle under here, you think that you're actually standing underneath a dome. But in fact, it's all painted. They weren't allowed to build a dome because the neighbours were complaining it would block out the light. So they actually have a flat roof, and they painted a dome. And it works. It's very colourful, and it looks rather beautiful. This foreshortening is really extraordinary, and there's a professor in the University of Dundee who's done a lot of work on it. Actually, to get that exact figure on your retina, you'd have to stand about 40 metres away. So they actually are distorting distortions, the artists, when they're making these pictures. As Caravaggio was the first to do it. Your hands don't look like this if you're standing in real life in front of these pictures, but extraordinary effects. Again, using our knowledge. We're coming now onto illusions of colour. Matte bands, if we have a shade of grey here, separating two different shades, we get a false illusion of white and a false illusion of dark. Why is that? It's thought to be due to these receptive fields. It also explains the chevreau illusion. This doesn't look like a single flat band. This looks like a corrugated sheet. Fluting. It's important because it might affect the way people read X-rays. And it might definitely affect the way machines read X-rays. The corn sweet illusion. Do these colours look the same to anybody in the audience? They don't to me. But unfortunately they are, and if you put a black band down the middle, those two colours you will agree are the same. So why don't they look the same? It's because we put a small gradient here, and that gradient is telling us something really important about a boundary. So, and that boundary, for example, the lid of this box looks much darker than the bottom bit of this cooler. But as I've shown in the bar here, they are exactly identical colours. And this other illusion that we created here, it actually works. If you put a band of a different colour, or the same colour, in front of a bunch of oil barrels, you will see illusory bands of where it is lighter, darker, lighter, darker, lighter, darker. Complete illusion. That is that band. I've just moved it in two different places. Furthermore, we can affect what we see. These two greys are the same. If you don't believe me, there they are. But if you put them behind different gratings, they appear differently. It also works for colours. These colours appear to be completely different shades of grey. Here we have Liverpool, here we have Manchester United. This illusion may work, and I'm not sure if it doesn't. So if I see lots of disappointed shaking your heads, what you do is you look in the middle and you see illusory grey dots appearing in the grid. And this was explained beautifully by the centre surround. So we get here, we get more inhibition, so when we're looking off to the side, it's going to fire and we're going to see grey. Now this was a beautiful theory, but unfortunately it's wrong. And as they say, there's always an easy solution to every human problem. It's neat, it's plausible, and wrong. And that was Henry Mencken, who wrote this in his essay, The Divine Afflatus. This was misquoted entirely as being in the BMJ not so long ago as a quotation from Yogi Bear. Now, as we know, Yogi Bear's quotation, he said, "I'm a very particular bear." I think they meant Yogi Berra, who, out of many bon mots, said, "Nobody goes there anymore, it's far too crowded." And they finally said, "I never said most of the things I said." And many others, like it's déjà vu all over again. A real wonderful sportsman and bon mot. Now, Peter Schiller has come with a completely different explanation, which seems to be more plausible, and he's basing it on these direction-sensitive fields that we mentioned earlier in the lecture, which are in the visual cortex in V1. And these explain all the problems which surround concentric fields in the retina don't. For a start, if it is based on concentric fields, why does it exist if it's two different sizes? This grid is half the size of this, but you still see them. If it's based on centre and off-centre being a particular, why does it work in a reverse grid? You still see grey dots in the middle there as well. So the retina theory cannot explain what we're seeing. So politely we could say it doesn't explain all the facts. This theory does. Here's a variant created by the wife of a mathematician, Elke Lingelbach, and this is scintillating. I don't know if it works. It's working for me here, and it's really quite disconcerting as you look around here. Here's something that doesn't exist. Most people, when they look at this, can see a circle here, or a square here. Furthermore, that circle and that square are brighter than the background. Same with this triangle, the Kanitsa figure. Now, playing with these borders, if we look here, we can see that Necker cube, and here we don't see a cube. The only difference is that we've completed the ends here, so we don't have that sense of wanting to complete things that enables our brains to make sense. These completion effects lead to these beautiful things called neon colour spreading. Can you see a ghostly blue here, which doesn't exist? We're inventing this, and it's here. And I've put this in your handout. You'll see there's a beautiful grey appearing where it's grey and different colours. And this has now been mapped to the brain, and they can look and map this colour spreading. And really extraordinary work being done on this at the moment. Our visual systems play tricks with the light. And one of the biggest tricks they play with is for millions of years we've evolved where there was only one source of light, and it was from up there. So we look at this and we see that there are knobs, and we look here and we see there are holes. And if we reverse it round, we see exactly the opposite. The same figure, it's just reversed. And you can have a look at that in your handouts and convince yourself that that's correct. Later on, we invented light that came from other directions as well, and this is Joseph Wright's famous painting on the orrery lamp, which has several things of interest here, actually. These faces mimic the moon as it goes through its phases. So here we actually have the new moon and the gibbous moon on the other side. Shadows, very important. These are exactly in the same place, but they look as if they're in different places. And there's a number of moving illusions that you can see where balls appear to shoot up and dash down in the air using that. It was used in the Renaissance to give a sense of depth and shade and direction of where the sunlighting might be. And Adelson showed various tricks with this, and Bolotto's variant here from London. A and B are exactly the same shade of grey. To persuade you of that, I've put a little ladder here. A and B are exactly the same shade of grey. A and B, the same shade of grey. Extraordinary, but true. Here's the Necker cube. We haven't got time for you to look at this for long enough, but if you look at this for a while, it reverses. So sometimes we see this face in front, sometimes we see this face in front. Furthermore, there's a very interesting version of it currently in the Saatchi Gallery, where half of the Necker cube is present, and the other half you're seeing in the mirror. So you've got a couple of mirror illusions going on to look at that. That's quite an extraordinary installation. There's several of them as well. It works for this shape. What are we seeing here? A V going that way, or a V coming up this way? Are we seeing the closed book, or are we seeing the papers of an open book? And that flips. It's an ambiguous. It works for stairs, Schroeder's stairs. The Thierry figure is extraordinary. When we look at this figure here, we either see a box like this, or we see a box coming out to us with a shade on that side of it. What's interesting, when this figure flips, the colour changes. The grey goes darker. We haven't changed the lighting at all. So if you look at this for long enough and then watch it as it flips, it's an OMG moment, isn't it? My goodness, it's suddenly gone darker, which it wasn't before. Extraordinary things happen, don't they? Here's the original sort of, I suppose, ambiguous figure. Here's several that were done which were meant to be humorous. They're probably too realistic to be humorous. This is marriage a la mode sort of thing here, the happy couple, and you invert it, and this is what it looks like after marriage. This is the beautiful woman facing this way, and the mother-in-law facing this way. And here's the whole flipping family together, the fellow with his moustache, the wife, and the beautiful daughter with her hat on, looking the other way. The final class I wanted to come on to in this particular part was on impossible objects, which are impossible triangles, which were originally invented by Oscar Reuterswärd. In fact, they weren't, but the original modern inventor of them was this. Penrose, with his triangle, former Gresham professor, of course, after going to a talk by a famous Dutch painter called Escher, who we'll come on to, sent him this and the impossible staircase. This was before the paintings had been published. Why do they work? The reason is we see this as a plausible figure when we look at this bit. It looks very reasonable. And then we look at the bottom bit, and that bit also kind of looks reasonable. It looks like a real triangle. But when we take the whole thing together in a Gestalt, it just doesn't work for us. And whatever we do, we can't make that work. But you can if you're Australian. And here is the impossible figure. Unfortunately, you have to look at it from the right angle to see, and that's what they've done. So geometrically, we can put any shape onto our retinas and perceive what we want. The science of doing this is quite old, perhaps going back to China, but the isometric view was formalized by William Farish. And it's how you look at something. So you're going to look at a cube as this. And very interesting things happen if you end up with two balls, not at the same level. I say it's very old because it's been used in architecture for a long time. This is the floor tiles of St John Lateran that I took earlier this year, and here are the floor tiles in the palace in Mantua, both of which are showing this illusion, which is subsequently going to be used by Escher for this continuous flow of water, which is actually much older, as we showed before. And it's even much older than that. Giovanni Piranesi, Pirahu, he drew all of these etchings and diagrams of impossible factories and prisons and so on, which are full of these illusions. This was the impossible cube. Here's the boy holding it. I had to highlight it because you won't see if I don't. And these are impossible cubes. Roger Shepard, wonderful scientist, brilliant artist, has a wonderful sense of humour and has produced some amazing images here. This is the Poyut, or Blivet, or the Impossible Trident. Mad Magazine published it. Here he is. But it doesn't actually work, does it? There's something very odd about this figure. They called it a Poyut. If you want to know why it's called a Poyut, have a look at your keyboard. Why a Blivet? It's US Army slang, basically, for £10 of manure in a £5 bag. Or an unmanageable situation, crucial but damaged tool, or a very important person. It's still used by the US military to describe a non-refillable container, such as a bag of liquid, such as those bags of fuel that are dumped over Afghanistan to forward forces. And here's Roger Shepard's version again. Now, distortions have been used in art famously for a long time, popularised nowadays with different versions of these impossible figures, and this is a bit odd, really, isn't it? It's a courtyard, or are we looking at the corner of a wall? And Seguin as well. But again, it predates all of them. It's much older than that. Look at Hogarth's impossible triangle here. This wasn't invented in the 20th century at all. Look at this woman giving this gentleman a light for his cigarette there. These sheep are getting larger as they're going further away. This man is fishing here, over the top of this man who's fishing here. There's loads. It's great fun, this etching, and well worth another look at several occasions. I think this is probably the highlight of it. It was tried by Bruegel, not quite as good, but definitely prefiguring. And if we mess about with what is figure and what is ground, we end up with extraordinary problems. This is the vase illusion, where we see two phases, or we see a vase, and it flips. And that's because that flips even though we have knowledge of what vases are and what faces are. And this was the coronation mug, where we have Philip and Elizabeth on either side of it. And this comes in, and this bleeds this figure ground by the way the brain is working. Now here's an illusion. Can anyone see the illusion here? Anybody? You must. People under 12. Can you see the illusion here? Help me. No? This is one of the world's commonest illusions. And we see it subliminally. Okay, it's an arrow. In fact, there's several arrows. It's a figure ground effect. No? Okay, let's help you out here. It's the arrows here. And this is implying that FedEx, straight as an arrow, fast, going to deliver things accurately and on time, subliminally. What a wonderful logo. Now you've seen that, unfortunately, you'll never not see it ever again. You'll always see the white arrow sticking in. It's one of those figure ground illusions that we mentioned before. Messing with figure and ground can do interesting things, such as camouflage. These are ibexes, and they're camouflaged. They're white underneath. There's a reason why animals are white underneath and dark on top. It's for camouflage. Messing about with this led to them in the First World War doing proper camouflage. The camouflage the British used in the Abyssinian War was really just khaki. Just wasn't exactly a true camouflage. Just meant they were slightly more difficult to see than the red soldiers lined up. But a big line of brown soldiers swearing and making a lot of noise were just as easy to shoot as the red ones. Gertrude Stein describes, actually, walking World War I, then this cannon went past, like this. And Pablo Picasso turned to her and said, "C'est nous qui avons fait ça." It's us who've created this monster, we artists. And in fact, the artists were used, because you can't hide a ship. It's too big. So what's the function? You're just going to make it hard to hit. And hitting ships is a bit harder than you might think. You're in a submarine, you're underground, underwater, you're up, the ship's moving, it's a bit foggy, you don't know the speed it's moving, you don't know the distance it is, you don't know the angle it's coming at you, and if you put zigzag lines on it, makes all of that even more difficult. And this is the scary thing, when you're driving towards these speed traps in Europe, you don't know how far away they are to put the brakes on. And the same sort of zigzag camouflage is used for them. This was designed by Norman Wilkinson, and it was called dazzle painting. And it's interesting to see it's still used today. Very finally, I come on to motion illusions. These particular steps of luminance generate a very strong sense of movement. If you look at the top and you move slightly around, you'll see that moves. If you look at the bottom one, it actually is even more, I think on the handout you see, it's really horrible that, looking through the thing. The pinner illusion you can't do on a screen. You have to come and move in, and what you do when you move in is you see not only do they move, they rotate. And the reason they rotate is because they're acting as little vectors on these sensors in the brain. The barber pole illusion we all know about, and is really quite famous. And this is working because, well, it's not working on the film, but anyway, you know what it is. It's because a grating that's moved under two apertures always appears as if it's moving towards the end of the aperture. This is the same grating. And what's interesting, if you do an S-shaped aperture, you can see the grating moving in different directions as you go around. Other movement illusions, if we flick things, that's not actually moving. that's a flat screen as you go through the entry in Heathrow Airport. And it's moving, but it's not. It's an illusion. This is a really weird illusion. You don't need to move your eyes very much at all to see that peripheral drift. This is very similar to what visual migraines look like, and as you move up and down around this picture, you'll see them sort of squiggling in and out. And as you move up the red dots here, you'll see peripheral movement here as well. Fraser-Wilcox showed that here, but it's much more effective in this optimized Fraser-Wilcox. And in these, this is really disturbing, and so is this. And this, the snake illusion, is his most famous one, can actually induce nausea, motion sickness. This is a spinning figure who rotates and then spontaneously seems to rotate in the other direction. Sorry, it doesn't appear to be working here. We mentioned faces. There are special illusions of faces. Canada had to withdraw this £5 note because people complaining they could see the devil in the Queen's hair. People can see faces anywhere. They saw the face in 9/11 of the devil. They saw it again in the other tower. You can see the face of the devil in people you know very well, as Thompson showed with the Thatcher illusion. All I've done here is to flip that photograph, where the eyes are the right way up and the mouth the right way up, to that. It's the same photograph, just flipped. Now, this was this illusion of face that I really, really wanted to show you of Richard Gregory, and it would be superb if there was something I could do that could make that work. And I'll just see if I can, since, no, it's not going to work on this setting, which is a shame. But essentially what that is showing is that as we move the cancel, let's see if it works now. Yes, it might do. This is the hollow mask I showed you before. This is the outside of it, which sticks out, but as it turns round, the hollowness flips out into our faces. And it's really, really, really scary. And very briefly to finish, these effects are used in art, and this op art, which is quite famous and quite topical. It became very famous in the 1960s after a famous exhibition in New York. Bridget Riley here is going to be exhibiting in 4 weeks' time over the road at the National Gallery, in London, showing a lot of the illusionistic effects. The Temple of Radiant Light, that yellow looks brighter than it actually is as the background. And finally, illusions are all around us. It's how we see. And this was the picture I took the other day. This is the size of the sun at dawn. We've got mist illusions. We've got an Orbison illusion on the back of this ambulance. We've got the Wundt Herring illusion at the top. Moon-sun illusion, Ponzo illusion in this car. The size illusion, that's the same image as that. I've just moved it for you. The car hasn't suddenly put a dinky toy in front there. But when it's out of context, it looks good. A Poggendorf illusion. These lines down here behind these trees all appear to have a Poggendorf. There's dozens of Poggendorf illusions there. Colour constancy. That didn't look like that. The cars haven't got their lights on. This was normal daylight to us. It was green, and reds were red, and blues were blue. And the Zollner illusion down here, done to make you slow down when you're coming up to junctions. So look around, they're everywhere, and do enjoy them. We still don't know what a lot of them are caused by, but they're certainly great fun, and they're certainly teaching us a lot about how we see. Thank you very much.